Hi everyone, I'm Dr.Animaction. Welcome to the third episode of the Personnel Office. So far in this series, we've covered one fairly realistic character with Grunt, and one that's significantly less so with Flash. Continuing our progress through the 1982 Joe catalog, though, means that today we're going to be taking a look at one of the guys who took a leadership role in early G.I. Joe history with Stalker. Will he be more toward the Grunt or Flash end of the spectrum? Well, let's get into it and see. As we've been doing, let's start with the file card and take a look at the front side of the blister pack. Here is actually where I have my first real issue with Stalker, since he's identified as a Ranger. That in and of itself is fine, but he's wearing a green beret, or even worse if you look at the art, a camouflage one. We'll focus on the green though, as that's how he's most often portrayed. The issue here is that the Rangers officially wore black berets from 1975 to 2001, whereas the green beret has been reserved exclusively for Special Forces since 1953, and became official for them in 1962. There is a history of berets of other colors being worn throughout the 70s, but even then there was never a camouflage one, and no other units ever tried to adopt green. At least not the same green as Special Forces. Also, as long as we're talking about berets here, I'll mention that his doesn't have a flash or a crest, which every enlisted soldier should have. The flash is a shield-shaped patch of various colors depending on the unit you're assigned to, and the crest is the official symbol of that unit. Every beret should have these, with the crest replaced by rank insignia for officers, regardless of color. Briefly here, let's also address his code name. In plain English, to stalk as a verb means to pursue stealthily, which sounds perfectly fine for a soldier in most instances. I actually have a small issue with it being assigned to this character though, as in the real military, stalk refers to a very specific activity and type of training. It's actually a component of sniper training, and is a skill they spend a very significant amount of time learning and developing. I think Stalker is a cool code name, but from that perspective, wish they'd used it for a character with a different documented skill set. Anyway, let's flip things over and see what his file card has to say. One thing I want to point out while we're here is the service number, which is that SN in the top right. These were issued to soldiers all the way up until they were discontinued in 1969, at which point they just started using social security numbers. So technically, none of the Joes would have one, but if they had still been in use, they'd also be the easy way to tell which service branch each member came from, since not only was the Army the only branch that really used them, but that RA prefix, which Grunt and Flash both have as well, stands for regular Army. There weren't any Joes from any other branches until 1984 when Gung Ho, Torpedo, and Ace joined, but keep this in mind when we get to them, and you'll see how their service numbers differ. Moving on though, as with the first two characters we've covered, Stalker is primarily an infantryman, or 11 Bravo. That makes sense for pretty much all of the original Joes, and a lot of the soldiers that go through Ranger School do come from the infantry. I will note, however, that you don't have to be infantry to be a Ranger, and it's a school rather than an MOS that awards a unique identifier and an appropriate badge. Moving on though, we see that he has Medic and Interpreter listed as a pair of secondary specialties. I have a couple of issues here, but we'll start with how much time this would take. Army Medic School is 16 weeks long, and Language School ranges from 36 to 64 weeks. With his file card listing 4 languages as well as Intelligence School, which for basic intelligence analysts is 13 weeks long, that would have put him in schools for multiple years of a career at this point. That's not necessarily unheard of, but it's pretty unlikely. What would be more realistic is the same thing we've talked about with additional trainings instead of whole other specialties. Looking at the medic specialty first, it's more likely that he took the 2-week Combat Lifesaver course, which I actually took myself. In that course, you learn advanced aid techniques like administering an IV, performing first aid and dressing specific types of wounds, casualty transport and carry techniques, triage, and medevac coordination. Medics, meaning people with an actual 68 Whiskey MOS, are generally very specialized and reserved for actual medical units, but most infantry units have at least a couple of Combat Lifesavers per company. As for the interpreter specialty, it's not unheard of for soldiers to speak multiple languages. In fact, most Special Forces operatives have to speak a second language. I even had a company commander once who was fluent in 7 of them, but again, most of these are either as additional trainings or just documented skills you already have. In my commander's case, he was a chemical officer but spoke 7 languages. But this means if you're bilingual and join the Army, you can take a test in your second language to get rated in it and have it added to your records. So I'd guess that Stalker maybe went to language school once or twice, but then just self-taught and tested out in the others rather than ever having a 09 Lima MOS designation. And as for the intelligence school his file card lists, they mention in Snake Eye's origin story from the comics that he and Stalker were part of a LRP unit, or Long Range Recon Patrol. Most Army soldiers that operated in any kind of recon capacity eventually take a 4-week course, currently called the Reconnaissance and Surveillance Leaders Course, that teaches advanced recon and surveillance tactics, so I'm guessing that's the school this entry refers to. Moving further down the card, we see his rank listed as E5, which makes him a sergeant and therefore the first non-commissioned officer we've covered. In most infantry units, including the Rangers, sergeants are usually squad leaders, so it's appropriate that he'd take on a leadership role in early Joe stories. Oddly enough, Stalker's Order of Battle and Impel trading card entries list him as having an SP5 rank, or Spec 5. Spec 5 and 6 were continuations of the E4 specialist rank that were assigned to people with technical specialties, but they were discontinued in 1985. Lastly though, let's take a look at his weapons qualifications, where it lists the M14, M16, and M1911A1, all of which, as I've said before, are fairly infantry standard, even though the M14 left service in the mid-70s. The odd ones out here are the M3A1 grease gun and the M32 pulverizer submachine gun. The M3 grease gun, called that because it's shaped like a grease tool you'd use for lubricating machinery, first saw service in World War II and was mostly phased out by 1959. There were some that were still in use all the way up to the 90s, but not by the infantry, since they were cheap and pretty much disposable and had been replaced by several superior options by then. As for the M32 pulverizer, well, there's no such gun. Stylistically, though, it's pretty similar to some of the submachine guns and assault rifles produced by Heckler & Koch, so we'll assume it's one of those that Joe slapped a designator on. That would be fairly realistic, since a lot of special operations units have used various H&K weapons since the late 70s. So overall, I don't have many complaints about his weapon qualifications, other than some of them being a little out of date. Now though, let's move on to look at his equipment, both what's molded on his figure and what he came with. We already talked plenty about the beret, so let's look at his uniform, as he's the first Joe so far not wearing plain army greens. Instead, he's wearing camouflage in a tiger stripe pattern, which is period appropriate for Vietnam-era recon soldiers, and is used almost exclusively for jungle warfare, though it was mostly replaced by more modern patterns by the early 70s. Considering what some of the later Joes would wear, though, that's really not a problem. The fact that he appears to be wearing a sweater, though, is a little odd. There are shirts in the modern military worn by different units made out of a sweater-type material that have shoulder boards and sleeve pockets like pictured here, but they're relatively new and made out of space-age type materials. Older Army sweaters, even from the time I was on active duty, were heavy in wool. They're hot and they absorb moisture, which is pretty much the exact opposite thing you'd want your shirt to be and do in a jungle environment. Continuing on though, we see he's wearing pretty standard issue load-bearing equipment, or web gear, but like Grunt is missing canteens and ammo pouches. He's also got the same type of outdated grenade. He's also got those arm and leg pouches, which could hold pretty much anything. For the record, most older uniforms don't have arm pockets, but the leg ones are pretty common, as all military work uniform pants have cargo pockets. Oddly enough, you're not allowed to carry anything in them though. I never understood that. Anyway, the last molded detail of note is the boots, which as far as I can tell are standard Army issue leather boots. That's fine, but most people geared up to fight in the jungle would be wearing the lighter, more comfortable, and most importantly more breathable jungle boots. In this era, both were acceptable options in uniform, so it was kind of up to personal preference. Shifting focus to the equipment he came with though, we find just that M32 pulverizer submachine gun, which we already decided wasn't real, but was close enough. But as someone notionally there to fill a recon and surveillance role, Stalker should really have more equipment to sustain him being in the field for longer periods, and he should definitely have one notably missing piece of equipment: a radio. Conducting recon is great, as long as you can tell other people what you find. So that's my look at Stalker, comparing him to a real-world equivalent. They honestly got quite a bit right with this character, and he's a great design. There are just a couple of small things I would have changed around, but overall I'd say he's pretty realistic, and even his mustache is within regulations. Anyway, check back next time when we look at the Joe's original bazooka trooper, Zap. Let me know your thoughts about the video in the comments. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned and stay tuned, as in cartoons. Later.